As we begin our sessions talking through some of the books of the Old Testament that were important to the Reformers, it makes good sense to start at the very beginning with the book of Genesis, which has so many famous stories and episodes, and of course sets the scene for the Bible to come. Beginning even within Genesis, at the very beginning, it's hard in any interpretation or reading of the Bible to get past the importance of creation. The very first chapter of Genesis, in the beginning, and these are Tyndall's, right? Tyndall's
words,
formulation.
yes, absolutely.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then the 7 days of creation with that sort of particular ordered, right, notion of creation. This sense of everything being put in its appropriate sort of place and space, as I understand it, is something that was picked up on in Reformation interpretation. Is that?
Yeah, I think you can think about it in a variety of ways. First of all, the Reformers were clear that the Pentateuch was written by Moses, and so when you hear them talk about it, but yet within that they are aware of a variety of different questions that intrigue them, and we'll come back to those in a moment. But at the beginning, where does this start? Calvin says that the story of creation, as revealed to Moses, is of God revealing himself to. This is a God who reveals, and this is the beginning point. And Calvin raises the question, 7 days. Why did he take 7 days? What was God doing before? And what does this structure of the 7 days actually mean? So there's a lot of questions that are being asked. But you're right in saying that this structure of creation, the creation story, is for the Reformers, Calvin and Luther before him, is the order of salvation. It is the structure of the human existence. It is the story of salvation. Luther says that the creation story and the story of Adam and Eve tells us a whole range of things. How sin comes into the world. They believe that it reveals the nature of God. It reveals a whole range of things that determine the salvation story.
Yeah, with Adam and Eve in particular, there's a question that the Bible itself seems to raise. I mean, in the biblical story of Adam and Eve, they've had this sort of Garden of Eden existence that is not anything like the world that we live in.
No.
And the fall, as it's understood traditionally, the fall of man, is really what gives rise to the civilization that we live in now, right? The expulsion from the garden allows us all to live and work in the world. And it raises the question, I mean, again, I think this is inherent in the Bible, was that a good thing in the end or a bad thing in the end, right? When the eating of the fruit and the sin and the fall was necessary for everything that came after it, and I would assume that for Christians especially, right? I don't see how you get to Jesus without the fall of man. Yeah. And so, is the fall of man good, bad?
This is a great question, and it's at the center of one of the most vibrant and controversial debates of the 16th and into the 17th century that Calvin finds himself at the center of. What is the nature of the fall? Did God will the fall? What is the relationship between God and humanity in the fall? And this becomes cast in sharp relief with the question of predestination. Did God permit? Did God will this to happen? And then ultimately this leads to Calvin's critics saying that Calvin holds a position that God is the actual author of evil because humanity had no choice in what happened. So this very story at the beginning of Genesis is so central to the major debates of the 16th century as the Reformers are trying to work out, having rejected what they called a kind of works righteousness and having faith alone. What are the implications of that, and how do you understand the nature of God and God's relationship to humanity, as I say, and how is that explained in terms of what happens at the beginning Genesis. So these are really live questions, as they will continue to be into the 17th century with the whole discussion of predestination. So this text is very much at the heart of the debate.
Right. It seems to me that the other aspect of Genesis that speaks to the question of God's relationship, you have sort of the universalist aspect in the story of the fall, but the story of Abraham and sort of the selection, right? The chosen one, the being chosen people, and the making of covenant. I mean, you brought up the works righteousness, and I'm thinking of right in Genesis 15, because Abraham had faith.
Yes.
It's obviously a central text for Paul.
Yes.
But this plays into the covenant concept also in the Reformation,
and particularly in the Reformed churches, though not alone, but in the Reformed churches, this notion of the covenantal relationship, and that they see themselves, through Christ in the true covenantal body that exists in this relationship with God, where God's promises are true and eternal, and they can trust in those if they remain faithful. They see themselves as the in terms of the Israelites, they read themselves into the story of Abraham and succeeding generations, and derive. I mean, we get this in the theology of Calvin, but you get this emerging more clearly in later writers, though his contemporary Heinrich Bullinger is an important voice in this respect, is this notion of the church in a covenantal relationship. And again, Genesis, the Genesis story is important.
In Genesis, one of the things that you see in the process of the covenant is the selection, right?
Yes.
It's one family, it's one people, and there's an understanding. There's the language in Genesis 12 of through you all of the other nations will be blessed.
Yes.
Do the Reformers pick up on this notion of if we identify ourselves with Israel, with Abraham's line, that means that there are others right out there who are excluded from? Does this play into notions of whether we should be proselytizing, whether we should be trying to convert, or is it? Are they thinking just simply, the Bible is really about us, and that's the important part?
Yeah, I mean, there's again a range of views, but there's certainly a strong sense that emerges out of the Reformed tradition in the 16th century that the elect are few,
right,
and that they are God's chosen, and that is, as Calvin would say himself, the doctrine of predestination is a comforting one. It is one that you can trust in God's promises. God will never abandon you, that you are suffering in this world and you are persecuted in this world by those others because you are the faithful, and and we will talk about in other books of the Bible this sense of affliction and persecution as representing or as signs of true faith. And it's often said of the Reformed tradition that they don't engage in proselytizing or missionary work because of this strong sense of covenant. I don't think that that's necessarily true. I mean, we see plenty of examples of going out into the world. I think what's much more important is this sense of the covenantal relationship between the church and God, as that it cannot be undone. And that's how you identify yourself.
When you use language about God's promises being eternal and never be, so what comes to mind for me when I think about Genesis is the moment when God seems to actually put that in jeopardy, which is Genesis 22, right? There's the binding of Isaac, the sacrifice of Isaac. This moment the chapter that begins with God tested Abraham, and when Abraham passes the test, is because you were willing to do this, therefore I sort of affirm my covenant with you, which is jarring, I think, even in the context of Genesis. Was it in fact a sort of unilateral, I promise you this kind of covenant, or was it subject to a test and faith? Does that chapter, I mean, beyond the obvious Christological, which is a very ancient interpretation, does this notion of God testing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and you just need to look at the literature of the 16th century to see whether it's about plague, whether it's about persecution, martyrologies, even ghosts, which are demons, in Protestant view. These are all sent to test And when they're trying to make sense of the world and why things are so terrible, it is the sense of God will never abandon you, but your faith is being tested. And again, the Old Testament texts are so important for the preachers and writers who are speaking to that question.
Mm-hmm. So when I think about Genesis more generally, there are obviously these high points of creation, that are obviously very big, mm-hmm. big stories. But most of Genesis is really a family story, right? It's about 3 generations of a single family as they make their way through a land and move around and settle and marry and intermarry and live and die. These are the parts that, at least today, are often taken as sort of exemplars for how we live in family and in community. These are examples of faithful marriages and how children should relate to their parents, and which is much of what Genesis is about, is children disobeying or children obeying, and wives following or not, etc. Reformers who took the Bible as sort of a guide, they saw it as sort of, this is how society should be structured. Were these sort of interpersonal matters for them also sort of biblically grounded in these kinds of stories?
Yeah, I think you really put your finger on it when you talk about the exemplary nature of this. The Reformers, Luther speaks of the Old Testament as being law, but he also talks about it in terms of being examples of faithfulness and unfaithfulness, and that these types are models, positive and negative. And so that these stories from Genesis, or right through to the end of the book, are to be seen as ways in which people are instructed to live or not live. And so there is this, and this is true for Calvin. It's true for Heinrich Bullinger. It's true for all the major reformers who write on Genesis, and where their Genesis appears in their preaching or texts, that the characters of the book play a crucial role in instructing people how to live or not to live, and what a Christian life should look like. And it goes to the way in which the Genesis, but the whole of the Old Testament is read as instructive.
I think it's probably worth saying, though, that at least in my experience, it's often the case that it's a two-way street. Mm-hmm. That is, they look to the Bible for guidance on how to live, but they also people also imprint their own values onto biblical characters. You see this in Jewish interpretation of Abraham, right, as not only obviously the model of faith, but also somebody who carried out the law perfectly. Right, even before it was given, right? He was even before Sinai. Abraham was perfectly faithful according to every detail of the law, right? And that's them sort of putting themselves into the biblical figure. Yeah. I can only imagine the same thing was true for the Reformers. That it was not just, well, I wonder what the characters in the Bible were doing. Let's do that, but more, I think the characters in the Bible are probably doing what we.
Oh, absolutely. You see this very clearly, that models of conduct, in the 16th century, which are set out in not only the writings but in the legislation that framed Protestant communities, frequently make reference to biblical characters, and those characters are shaped to be models of contemporary society. Mm-hmm. They're being read very much into the world of the 16th century Reformation. We see that going beyond Genesis. One of the examples, and we'll speak about it shortly, with David. What Calvin does with David in the Psalms is extremely interesting. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways in which these characters in Genesis are appropriated is that we see a bit like Erasmus and Jerome, you see individual reformers identifying very clearly with biblical characters. So there's a kind of symbiosis or a symbiotic relationship between the way in which the reformers present themselves and a certain image of those biblical characters.
Mm-hmm. There's always I mean, Genesis is such an enormous book. There's more to say. We only have time for a few highlights before we move on to another central book. But I think it's safe to say that for those of us, if you want to go back and read, right, Calvin or any of these people, there are voluminous commentaries on Genesis that really make clear just how central this book was to them.
Yes. We find some really surprising moments in those commentaries. The story of Lot's wife. We think we know that story, and one would assume that someone, like Calvin, who writes extensively on it, would have a very clear view of it. But he actually tells us something that unexpected. He tells the story, of course, that when God's judgment upon her being turned into a pillar of salt does not mean that she has been condemned for eternity. Because he says what we see is not necessarily what God wills for eternity. And so that he says, we cannot assume or presume to know what God's judgment is. We see what we see, but we cannot from what we see in this world, which is imperfect, divine from it what God has decided. And so it's a story that he gives it a completely different spin to, which shows that the book for them is incredibly central to what they think about God, the world, and themselves.